So, you've decided your fantasy world needs a little bit of divine intervention. Fair enough, but how do you want to go about it without just copying the Greeks or the Norse? In this video, we're going to be talking about fantasy pantheons and religions as a whole. They can be crucially important to your worlds and may even be one of the first things you want to work on. We're going to start with how they're organized, what they might do, but we're also going to talk about how they fit into people's everyday lives. The first part of the process is Step 1, Pantheon Structure. When world building and figuring out exactly who is doing the world building in universe, it helps to start out by figuring out how many gods there are and how they're organized. I'd say there are roughly 3 categories for this. There is the monotheistic, pantheon, and polytheistic. You might say,
"But J-Bat, pantheons are polytheistic."
and while you're technically correct is the lamest type of correct, and there's a difference that I'll explain once we get there. But first, monotheistic. This is both the easiest and the hardest option at the same time. It's easy because you've only got to worry about one god, and it's hard because you have to make that god have more to them than just being the one god. If your monotheistic pantheon's god is said to have created the world and everything in it, you have to consider that they basically have domain over everything, as they had to make everything. What you want then is to give them some sort of eccentricity. Perhaps there's an element or some such thing they represent. A Gaia type god might favor nature, a Perun type god might favor lightning or some other such thing, while still technically having domain over everything. Often with these sort of gods, though, you'll benefit more from exploring the relationship between them and their followers rather than the god themselves, especially if you have a messiah figure in universe. You do have to be careful when writing this type of god, or they might just be emblematic of a real-world religion too much, or of the general idea of creation and nothing else to spice it up. That's why I recommend having that god either 1, have grown up as a mortal before ascending to godhood, in which they'll have their own unique story as to how they got there, or 2, have them be the only god of that pantheon, but other pantheons have other gods. The first option is true of Warhammer Fantasy, where Sigmar Unberogen was a real person who united humanity before ascending to godhood, and the second is true of Fire Emblem Three Houses, where Sothis is the sole god of the land of Fodlan, but there are other pantheons and deities in other lands. These approaches do mean that your monotheistic god couldn't have been responsible for the creation of all things, but it does expand your options a little more if you'd rather do that. The second religious structure is itself the Pantheon Structure. That is to say that, similar to a monotheistic structure, there is a set, organized, clear object of worship. It's just that there are many objects of worship rather than one. I specify, as it'll be relevant once we get to polytheistic, that in pantheon structures all of the gods are worshipped as a set. That doesn't mean they're all worshipped as much as one another or for similar kinds of things, just that a believer in one of them is a believer in all of them, even if any given individual might only favor 1 or 2 of them. For the purposes of fantasy settings, having multiple gods can give you a lot more options. The most obvious reason is because you have multiple deities, now you can actually give them different personalities and give them characters. Maybe they clash with each other, maybe they get along, or anything in between. You'll also likely want to give them some domains. Common ones include the leader god, the fertility, war, love, trickery, etc. However, especially if you want to stand out, you may want to depart from these structures. In my world, each of the gods has an elemental domain that corresponds with a type of magic that exists within the world. The heads of the pantheon are the Mother and the Soul Father, where the former created humans as creatures and represents physical healing, whereas the Soul Father imbued humans with spirit and represents spiritual matters. However, there are other gods, such as the Frostheart, who represent other types of things like winter and ice magic. It isn't a huge departure, but it's enough that I don't get it mistaken for another ripoff of some antiquity pantheon. The third structure is polytheistic. The key difference between this and pantheon is that there are multiple gods, but they are not necessarily worshipped as a set. This is, once you think about it for a moment, how a lot of real-world societies functioned. Characters who live in a polytheistic world might know that other gods are worshipped or even exist, but they will only focus on those who speak to them personally. A good example of this is, once again, Warhammer Fantasy. I mentioned Sigmar under monotheistic. As to his followers, he's pretty much the only deity that matters, but people do exist who worship other gods, such as Manan of the ocean, Tal of the Wild or Raya of the Harvest. They aren't part of the same pantheon and don't really have anything to do with each other, but are simultaneously worshipped both exclusively and non-exclusively by plenty of people. This approach can be very useful if the scale of your story is pretty wide and contains people from all sorts of different lands. One issue that can be run into when world-building religions in general is that if there are different sets of gods around, which there almost certainly are, is one of them right and all the others are wrong? Are they all just versions of the same thing? Choosing the polytheistic approach leads to a fairly satisfying conclusion of, they all probably exist and people just choose their favorites, essentially. In a broader context, this is also how my world functions outside of the region the story centers on. The gods of the main pantheon from that central region are separate from those of other cultures' pantheons, but more well-traveled people might acknowledge both that pantheon and those of other places. Overall, the most interesting thing to say about pantheon structure is that religion is complicated and you can have kind of all of the structures, or none of them, or anything in between. Anyways, that takes us to Step 2, Worship. In this stage, we've focused on how us mere mortals interact with the deities of your world and how their religion might have an impact on their society. But there are three main categories of worship when it comes to fantasy religions, and they all correlate with one of the previous pantheon structures. The first is a theocratic structure. As you might guess, this means that the religious organization dedicated to your pantheon either is or plays a very significant role in the government. Whether this is a medieval papal state on steroids or something closer to an official state church, the high priests of this religion have just as much to say on material matters as on spiritual. The overarching purpose of this kind of structure is almost always for the legal power granted to the religious organization to be abused, and for there to be a distinct difference between the will of the gods and the will of their most well-endowed servants. Obviously, it's more than possible to tell a story where a religious organization acting as government isn't inherently evil or corrupt, but you'll have a lot of grunt work to do in justifying why that is. At the end of the day, an organization with overwhelming say in not only how people should act, but also how they legally can act, is going to attract a lot of people with less than noble motives to join the ranks. The Imperium of Warhammer 40k functions this way, where the God Emperor, though sort of dead, it's a long story, is the absolute head of government. He doesn't talk much, however, so a group of largely religiously affiliated individuals act as the governing body of said Imperium, where any scent of heresy is repaid with swift and decisive action. The second is a formal structure. This is to say that the religious organization is organized, has some degree of wealth or influence, but is not necessarily involved in the governing of whatever region it finds itself in. It may have wealthy donors, perhaps lobbies individuals who are in government, or, depending on the setting, may have armed forces of its own, but it is distinctly not the government. This is the widest spectrum overall, as you can have a religious organization that almost has control over a government, or enough that said legal government is almost a puppet of the religious organization, but it's still an informal relationship. Something that is that way because of influence and soft power, not the law. On the other end of the spectrum, the organization may be completely uninvolved in politics, only concerned with spiritual matters. Perhaps it has an opinion on the current goings-on in politics, but it doesn't have to be doing much of anything about it. With this structure, the ethics of how this organization operates is less obvious. Given they're not in direct control, it's a lot easier to justify a less compromised or corrupt religious organization, but they can still act as a negative influence if that would be more appropriate to the setting. An example is my own universe. While the land of Meldon is ruled over by 3 distinct kingdoms, the Church of Iridian acts as almost a fourth power. It has significant influence across the continent, and while it is not legally enshrined anywhere, it has advisors placed in each of the kingdoms, and with the exception of certain unforeseen circumstances, none of the kingdoms would dare to act against it. However, it does not command any armies, only a knight's order that acts to serve its own interests. The third worship structure is the informal structure. This, as you might guess, is the opposite of the former two systems. Here, the religion is more of a commonly held and understood faith. There's not a religious organization holding it up, only scattered mystics, shamans, oracles, priests, or what have you. That in of itself is one of the most interesting parts of this structure. With the faith being so individualized and lacking in organization, it's naturally going to change over time like a centuries-long game of telephone. There may be religious disagreements, but they'd be closer to a 1v1 fistfight than a holy war. The informal structure also might leave the land more open to another, more formalized religion taking hold in the area. The disadvantage, at least on like a material, geopolitical level, of an informal religion is that there isn't an organization to resist some other ideology coming in, or to resist persecution on a large scale. The most obvious examples are those old pantheons that we are so used to talking about. The Greeks, the pre-Christian Romans, and the Norse would have had their faiths fall loosely in this category. There are plenty of fictional examples as well, but it can't hurt to investigate the real thing and how they impacted their respective societies. With that out of the way, that brings us to step 3, involvement. So now you know how your pantheon is structured and how the people worship them, but how involved are the gods in people's everyday lives? While this will be a fairly short step as the answers are fairly straightforward, it is worth thinking about. The first level of involvement is direct. This is something you're only really going to see in very high fantasy settings. At this level, the gods not only are undeniably real, but they actively take part in the dealings of mortals and might even make appearances. This can result in some particularly dramatic encounters and can be a hell of a lot of fun, but in equal measure, it must be handled with extreme care. If it seems like your mortal character's struggles could be solved if their god just got off his ass and struck their enemies down for them, and that is a thing that could reasonably happen in your universe because of how involved the gods are, you're gonna have a problem with stakes. Overall, it's very cool, but put some sort of limit on it so that your characters can still win by their own efforts. A quick and easy way to do this is if said god is busy with something of equal or greater importance. If they aren't omnipotent, then they can only be doing so many things at once. Warhammer Age of Sigmar is a good example of this level of involvement for the simple reason that literal gods not only show up in battle in various stories, but since it's a tabletop game, you can literally buy models of them and use them in the game. The second level of involvement is indirect. At this level, the existence of the gods is still going to be pretty difficult to deny. However, their presence in the world is much more restrained. Perhaps they perform miracles or let their will be heard by oracles, but they aren't exactly setting foot on the mortal planes themselves. This is one of the more common approaches, as it is fairly flexible and allows your gods to be involved in the story, but not to such an extent that they're in particular danger of flattening your stakes. Warhammer Fantasy is a good example of this level, as the involvement of the gods is a notch down from the successor setting I just talked about. Warrior priests of one of the main gods, Sigmar, can perform miracles, but Sigmar himself isn't the one doing them. It is something that those individuals can perform through their faith. The other gods are involved in similar amounts, granting certain abilities to their followers. The third and final level is subtle to none. At this level, it becomes much more reasonable or even correct to deny the existence of the gods themselves. Here their voices have gone quiet if they've even been heard at all. They don't do anything to directly impact the lives of their followers, or if they do, they are in ways that are difficult to prove or maybe difficult to explain. This is an easy way to go about it, as you solve the stakes problem pretty much entirely, and this can also be useful if you want to work with the idea of faith itself. It's a concept that really only is familiar to how we experience it if the characters cannot for certain prove that the gods they believe in are there. My world is something of a mixture between this setting and the former. The gods at one point may have been at an indirect level of involvement, but by the time of the narrative, that time has long since passed. Now they've gone quiet, and people begin to question if they're even still there, while others wonder if they can be brought back. If concepts of religion itself are something you want to hone in on in any way, this is a level of involvement that can lend to that quite a lot. So I think that about covers us for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video. Tell me about your own religious pantheons or some of your own ideas with your world building in the comments below, and I'll be sure to read each and every one of them. So thank you for taking a chance on a small channel, and remember, if you're out walking in the woods and you see Zeus coming towards you, whether as a person or as some animal form, run very far away.